Hello and welcome to the Ashland.News and Ashland Climate Collaborative Forum discussing funding for Ashland's water treatment plant. My name is Tara. I use she, her pronouns, and I am so glad to be serving as co-moderator for this program along with Ashland.News executive editor Bert Ettling. Before we get too far, I want everyone to know that this program is being recorded. We'll have it posted on our YouTube channel shortly after the presentation today. I also want to mention that the program is co-sponsored by the Ashland Climate Collaborative, and Erin O'Kelly-Muck, their executive director, is here with us today. Thanks for waving hi, Erin. Thanks for being here. Both organizations are acting in the role of neutral convener here, and we're not going to take positions on the ballot measure. And Bert and I will do our best to get to questions as they come up. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bert. Bert, if you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Bert Ettling. I'm the editor of Ashland.News. We launched in January 2022, and I'm glad to try and fill this local news desert vacuum of local news. So that's what we're working on, and that's why we're here tonight. If you'll bear with me, the reason we're here tonight is to discuss this ballot measure, and I'm going to read to you the measure as it appears in the voter pamphlet, so that we're all on the same page. Hopefully you've read it already, but we're gonna go through that again just to refocus on exactly what we're voting yes or no on. So this is measure 15-234, and it's whether or not to approve a resolution passed earlier this year by the city council, which is approving, we're voting on whether to approve Ashland Resolution 2024-05, authority to issue water revenue bonds. The question is, should the city be authorized to issue up to $75 million in revenue bonds to finance construction of water system improvements? The measure seeks voter approval of City of Ashland's authority to issue water revenue bonds under Resolution 2024-05 in an aggregate principal amount not to exceed $75 million to finance capital improvements to the city's water system, including but not limited to water treatment plant improvements and East and West Forks transmission line rehabilitation. The city anticipates the issuance of the water revenue bonds to the Federal Environmental Protection Agency under a federal loan program that is designed to help local governments invest in the replacement of aging water infrastructure. The measure is approved. The resolution grants the city authority to issue revenue bonds payable solely from water system revenues. The bonds will not be general obligations of the city, and neither the authorization or issuance of the bonds will authorize the city to levy any taxes. Approval of the measure will authorize the city to access funding through the EPA for its construction of the water treatment plant, addressing crucial water infrastructure needs. And that's as it appears in the voter pamphlet. And I will hand it back to, well, I'd also like to welcome Scott Fleury and Mariane Berry, and Tara will say a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Bert. I want to talk through our plan for the evening and emphasize that this forum is really intended to be an information sharing endeavor, and we're not here to debate what's the city's plans or financing plans for the water treatment plant, but more to make sure that we are providing information that folks need to be able to make up their minds in an informed manner about how to vote. Coming up here pretty soon. I got my ballot. I'm sure you all got yours or will soon. I do want to talk a little bit about our format tonight. We initially had planned to have presentations from city staff members, and then a panelist of folks that are proponents of the bill and opponents of the bill. Due to some disagreements about the format that we proposed, panelists in opposition pulled from the debate or pulled from the discussion. And rather than present something that was lopsided, we chose to also ask the proponents to step out of the conversation. So, in an attempt to try and be as equitable as possible, we've chosen to have our city staff members present alone. And it is really important to know that as staff members, they will not share their opinions tonight. Instead, they're in a position to provide us with facts from the city's perspective and through their content specialties so that we better understand the situation at hand. Bert and I will be paying attention to questions as they come up, and I want to talk just a moment about how that'll be administered, and then we'll go into introductions. So I'm going to share my screen for just a moment. And I want to let folks know that we are not using the chat function tonight. Instead, we'll be using the Q&A feature. So if you look at your menu bar for Zoom, you should see some version of this Q&A icon. In order to share a question with us, you'll need to click on that Q&A icon in order to pop up the Q&A tab, which looks like this. When that Q&A tab pops up, you can type your questions in and the panelists will be able to see those. We will be allowing something called upvoting as part of this process. So if someone types in a question, you're like, yeah, I need the answer to that, you can choose to upvote it. And you'll see a little a plus or a little thumbs up, thumbs down. So if you want to upvote, you can do that there. And if you are working on a tablet or on a phone, know that you can also click on that Q&A icon and it will give you a chance to type in your questions there. So hopefully that helps you work through the Q&A session that we're doing today. I know that we're keeping an eye on what's happening there. And after the presentations by our city staff, we'll be able to start to address questions. So I've mentioned our city staff members a whole lot, so let me introduce them and then we'll turn the presentation over to the two of them. So we've got Scott Fleury and Mariane Berry, and I see Bert, I'm stepping on your assignment. Why don't you introduce and I'll turn my mute on here.
Okay, Scott has worked with the city since 2006. He was Deputy Director of Public Works from 2017 to 2020 and is Director of Public Works since 2020. Thank you for being here, Scott. Appreciate you taking the time and working in the evening here. And Mariane Berry has joined the city leadership team in April 2023 as Director of Finance. Previously, she was Director of Budget Services at Rogue Community College. Thank you so much for being here, Mariane. Tara, back to you. Or do we, okay,
yeah,
let's begin
we can head into the presentation. So
okay.
I'm not sure which order would be best, but Scott and Mariane, you're both welcome to share the presentations you have prepared.
All right, well, let's try this. Everyone see the slide deck start? It's weird on the Zoom because you're kind of just presenting to yourself a little bit. Thank you everyone for having me here. And I'm just going to go through a few slides I prepared, which is similar to what I presented before the City Council in May of this year, kind of a project update and the who, what, where, when, and why. And then I think we'll move on to questions. More technical finance questions. That's why Mariane is here to assist from the finance director side. So don't be afraid to send her some finance questions. I'm going to put her on the hot seat as part of this overall process. But let's see. Not advancing. Oh, there we go. So just kind of an overview of what I wanted to talk about tonight, how projects are developed, specifically one like the water treatment plant, go over some of the why and the reasoning behind it. I want to provide an overview of the water treatment processes for treating water for the city, for the existing plant and what's proposed in the future new plant. Give an overall project update of where we are currently with the design of the new treatment plant. Talk about some construction impacts that the community will see. Give a quick overview of the Talent Ashland Phoenix tap water tie, where the city can receive emergency supply water, treated water from the Medford Water Commission through the tap intertie. And then I'll review the funding options and the funding process that we've been working on for specifically the water treatment plant project. So as an overall approach to project development, one of the things that the city does specifically for its enterprise funds, water, wastewater, storm drain, streets, is you develop a master plan. The master plan outlines kind of your goals and policies, your capital improvement needs, your level of service requirements, your regulatory oversight requirements. And in general, the council appoints a citizen committee to participate in the development of the master plan process itself. So with respect to water, the city council in 2010 appointed the Ashland Water Advisory Committee to participate in the development of the water master plan. That was about a 2-year process of multiple public meetings, council engagement on a feedback loop with presentations to them on the status and updates of the plan development. And then when the plan is ready to be adopted, it goes before the city council, and the city council adopts it as kind of that guiding document for that enterprise system. Once the council adopts the plan, then staff takes and implements it through the maintenance structure that we have in our budget, and also through the capital improvement plan. So when we have large scale capital projects, that goes into a 2- and 6-year capital improvement plan. That capital improvement plan is then brought before the city council for approval every budget cycle. And so that outlines projects like the water treatment plant, the East and West Fork transmission lines, major rehabilitation to the system to meet the community's demand in the future, and also meet regulatory requirements that are imposed on these enterprise systems. Once the capital plan is adopted, then we go through the budget process where staff requests appropriations to fund the enterprise fund. So that's the personnel services, the materials and services required, and the capital needs to adequately fund the enterprise itself. Once the budget is approved through the public process, then staff begins the project initiation stage for capital projects or maintenance projects. And that generally involves a formal solicitation for engineering and design, what we call a qualifications-based selection process. Generally, that's broken up into multiple phases, with the first phase being called what we call preliminary engineering and alternatives analysis. We go through that phase, and then we enter into the final engineering phase. And in the final engineering phase, the plans, specs, and estimates for the projects are developed. And then we go out for construction contracts and construction administration contracts for the work on the construction side. Now, each one of these stages, how we've tiered it, gets approved by the city council independently, so they know what's going on, the community knows what's going on at each stage of the process for these large-scale projects that we have in the works for our enterprise systems. Oops. Really fast. So the why specific to the water treatment plant. As I said, the water treatment plant project was originally fully envisioned in the 2012 Water Master Plan, and it again was listed and developed in the 2020 Water Master Plan. And it's essentially to replace aging infrastructure. The existing plant was constructed to a sand filtration plant upgraded in 1949, and then there's been some changes to the process and the system. In the 90s and in the mid-2000s, there's some updates to the plant as well. So it's to replace aging infrastructure. There's also certain risks associated with the current plant and its location in the canyon on the way to Rita Reservoir. As some of you may be aware, that the plant has been flooded out numerous times, specifically in 64, 74, and 97. There are landslide risk areas within that canyon near where the plant is located. The construction of the facility itself is unreinforced concrete, so it can be susceptible to earthquakes. And then also, one of the things that we have limiting factors of ability to handle our treatment and water quality concerns, specifically for the city. That's algae and turbidity and Reeder Reservoir. Also, as part of this overall design, we're ensuring that we meet the current and future demand for the population on their water needs basis for that kind of long-term planning period, because you're expecting this new facility to be high functioning for the 100-year window, we'll call it. As part of this, also, a couple times it's gone back and forth with the city council about rehabilitating the plant versus constructing a new facility. And from the policy standpoint, the city council repeatedly focused in on constructing a new plant to mitigate the risks and kind of allow the city to future-proof itself with respect to water quality concerns due to climate impacts that we're seeing in our raw water system of Reeder Reservoir. So I know not a lot of people have been to the site, and this is just a drone shot, aerial footage of the location. And you see the blue arrows running next to the facility itself. That is Ashland Creek. And so the facility directly abuts Ashland Creek itself in the canyon. Those red lines go up the hillside where we have very steep embankments of heavily vegetated woodland areas. So the space itself is kind of restricted and confined for expansion and changes. And so that's one of the reasons we looked at an alternate location to build the new plant and get rid of the risks that we see there from, as I said, landslide, flood, earthquake, as part of this new treatment plant project. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the water treatment processes. The current plant is what we call a direct filtration plant. So raw water comes into the plant itself. It goes through the powerhouse. We still generate power, hydroelectric power at the facility itself. Chemicals are added to that raw water in a coagulation process. That water with the chemical additions is then sent through flocculation basins, where the organic matter adheres to the chemical particles that are added to the raw water stream. And I call it creates, in some circumstances, what you can see kind of white puffy clouds of material. Then that flocculated water is then taken through anthracite coal filters, and those filters catch that particulate matter and remove it from the water system or the water itself. At that point, the water is sent to a clear well where it is disinfected with chlorine addition and then sent to the water distribution system. Now, what we're proposing in the new plant is a couple additional steps, and kind of what the Environmental Protection Agency calls this is a multi-barrier treatment approach. The two new steps are the addition of ozone, which is a high oxidant component that eliminates algal issues, taste and odor issues that are developed from algae in the water stream itself. Chemicals are added, same thing, and develop that flocculation. And then we add in a sedimentation step. Now, the sedimentation step is an addition to help with turbidity. So we see fluctuations with turbidity in the reservoir through flashy rain events that the watershed sees. Once it goes through that sedimentation step, then again, it goes to filtration, a clear well with chlorine disinfection, and then on to the distribution system and to your faucets. So as far as the current status of the project goes, we have 100% plans, specifications, and estimates for construction of the new facility. We've obtained planning approval through the City of Ashland's Planning Department, a conditional use permit for development on the parcel last fall. And the costing is broken into three different components. The primary component is construction of the water treatment facility and the appurtenance piping to connect the raw water to the new facility and the treated water to our distribution system. That cost range at 100% is $71 million on the high side to the $55 million on the low side. The other two components that have been developed as part of the project design are a solar array on the site to develop solar power for use in the treatment process to offset power costs and power consumption from the grid. And then also battery storage to provide another level of resiliency for the treatment plant itself. So if we have any sort of grid complications, the site will have a diesel backup generator, but potentially in the future, additional battery storage to run long term any sort of hazard event that the city might occur or be within the region itself. So some of the impacts that will occur, the first off, we're looking at about a 30-month construction window for the project itself, with about another 3 to 6 months of startup and commissioning the new plant before we fully switch over to the new plant and take the existing plant offline. We are also will be replacing the culvert where Ashland Creek goes under Granite Street, right there where the water treatment plant access road is. So during that time, there'll be a temporary parking reduction as we'll need to stage equipment and vehicles and materials at that location. One of the things that's come up numerous times in discussion is still ensuring that the trail system is accessible. I know the Wonder Trail wraps around there. And so that's one of the things we've worked on with Parks Department and other stakeholders to make sure that there's still adequate trail access while construction is going on. Now, just a little bit of information about the TAP connection. So this is the Talent Ashland Phoenix intertie, where the city receives supplemental emergency source water from the city of Medford through an agreement. The city formally connected in 2014 and then built the pump station that's down by TC Chevy, which boosts water in from Medford into the city's distribution system. The design criteria that was used for the TAP system was looking at being able to provide the community about 2 million gallons a day of water over a 5-month critical period using the existing water rights that the city purchased in Lost Creek Reservoir, which is 1,000 acre feet. The TAP system can be expandable to 3 million gallons a day with the addition of another pump at the pump station and some piping updates in the city's distribution system. And that 3 million gallons a day on the upper end is something that is been put in the contract with the Medford Water Commission, that they've said that they will not provide the city with more than that 3 million gallons a day total demand for the TAP system. And so they are using, the Medford Water Commission is using kind of that number as the maximum as part of their facility improvements that they're doing in their distribution system and as part of the Duff expansion, their water treatment plant. So that 1,000 acre feet equates to about 325 million gallons of water availability right now. And the city of Ashland generally, on average, uses about 1 billion gallons of water a year. So you see there's a little bit of a gap between the two, potentially. So onto the funding resolution. In spring of this year, the City Council approved Resolution 2024-05 that allowed for borrowing for water system improvements, as Bert said, up to $75 million. As required by statute, language in that resolution allows for community members to refer this resolution to the ballot. And that is what the measure on the ballot is for in November. As Bert said, a yes vote supports the council authorized resolution for issuance of revenue bonds. Primarily what we would be doing is that source through the Environmental Protection Agency to fund the construction portion of the project. A no vote opposes the resolution and require the city to consider alternative financing methods for the plant construction. The 2024 resolution rescinded a 2022 resolution that was passed by the council that allowed for borrowing up to $44 million. And the reason that it changed between 2022 and 2024 is the plant cost increase but we were also notified that the EPA would let us borrow 100% of the actual construction cost requirements for the project because the city has in-kind match as part of the 80-20 federal and local share for the WIFIA program. So through that in-kind match, the city owns the property where the project is to be constructed, and the city has also expended dollars towards the alternatives analysis and the engineering preliminary and final for the project. And so that's what got us to that $75 million maximum amount. I'll talk a little bit more about the EPA's program. It's called the Water Infrastructure Financing and Innovation Act. And it's a program developed by the federal government to assist municipalities in funding these large-scale projects of this nature. And a couple of years ago, the EPA extended the program a little bit to what they call the Small Cities Program, which is the 80% federal share with a 20% local match requirement. If you're not in the Small Cities Program, the federal share is 49% and the local share is 51% as part of their WIFIA program. Now, as part of this, the resolution makes a revenue pledge for repayment. So that means the water rates that community users pay will go to pay the debt service for this loan. The term right now is a maximum of 35 years, and the current interest rate after the Fed dropped rates is at 4.16%. Now, in general, and Mariane can speak to this a little bit more, the WIFIA loan, as far as the city operates, acts as a line of credit. So when we make payments towards the project, when we need to get reimbursed, we would make a reimbursement request to the EPA to reimburse us for expenses. When you make that reimbursement request, that's when the interest starts to accrue, and only on that amount you request reimbursement on as part of an overall funding mechanism. Other options for funding capital projects that is available to municipalities and that the city has used in the past is a revenue bond. The same thing, it's a revenue pledge for repayment for the enterprise system itself. The current kind of term and rate is 30 years for the maximum term, and the rate is 4.2%. And again, that's adjusted recently based on the federal interest rate reduction. One of the issues you have with a revenue bond is whatever you ask for in funding, they sell those bonds and you collect that full amount up front. And then interest accrues on that full amount once received. So, when I mentioned we would be looking at potentially a 30-month construction window, well, we would take that full amount in and pay out as the project goes on, but interest accrues on that full amount from day one as part of the process and project. The other, option is a general obligation bond, which is backed by the full faith and credit of the city, which is a property tax basis. And one of the reasons we didn't head in this direction at all is because it has broader financial implications to the overall city itself. And so that's why we stayed away from a GO bond as part of kind of the concept for funding this project itself. A couple other options include the state itself. They manage a Safe Drinking Water Fund, revolving fund. And the city has used that multiple times on projects in the past, including the TAP Intertie construction phase. One of the limiting factors for that program is they generally only loan up to $6 million as a maximum per project. So it would need to be combined with other sources to get to the full funding required for the project. One of the things that the city has done is applied for that $6 million loan. And in general, through their program, they have been for disadvantaged rate-paying communities applying about a 50% principal forgiveness to that. So I'm waiting word from the IFA business organ who manages the Safe Drinking Water Funds for the state on the potential to get that money, and that would help offset some of what we would need from the WIFIA loan itself, along with principal forgiveness, which WIFIA and EPA does not provide for any sort of principal forgiveness. the city has also investigated grants to offset the project cost. One of the things that the city is recognized for by the Oregon Health Authority is emerging contaminants, specifically algae. The bipartisan infrastructure law bill that was passed allocates money to the state to allocate to local municipalities for those emerging contaminants. And we applied for funding specifically for the pre-treatment system, the ozone and pre-treatment for the new treatment plant, because that is the component that manages algae issues for the city of Ashland raw water reservoir. We applied for 9.3 million in funding, and we've been put on the intended use plan by the state to receive that funding. Again, I'm hoping that we'll get more information, but we've requested that funding be available to the city in spring of 2025. Now, recently, the city council approved the natural hazard mitigation plan, which opened up additional grant funding opportunities for us to pursue. One of those is a FEMA grant called Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities, or BRIC grant. And this is kind of a proactive grant to hazard mitigation. And as I mentioned, with the current plant, its location susceptible to flood, landslide, earthquake, climate change impacts on the water quality, it opened us up to go after this grant funding. Now, we've made the application to the Office of Emergency Management to the state of Oregon, and we recently found out last week that we've been approved to move into what they call the sub-application component. So we are sub-applicants with the state's Office of Emergency Management to FEMA. Now that process takes about 24 months, depending on if you're selected to proceed after the sub-application is completed. So we would know potentially, best case scenario, in spring, summer of 2026 if we were selected for BRIC funding. BRIC program funds up to a maximum of $50 million for a project with a 10% match required by the local community as part of that program. And so we will know in about 8 to 9 months if the sub-application that the city will be submitting will move on for further consideration through the FEMA process. And that's all I have as far as my presentation and background.
I have one slide, Scott, that I can share if we still have some time. Bert and Tara, I'm not sure where we are on time, but let me share my
7 minutes remaining, so you have plenty of time if you've got one.
Okay, I have one slide, and some of it is redundant information, but just said a little differently, and I thought I would just go over it to anticipate any questions that might arise. So let me make sure I'm sharing the right screen here. Are we seeing the one slide? Yep. Okay. So again, like I said, some of it is repetitive information, just clarifying and reiterating what the measure is. And that is that it's voting on the financing of the water treatment plant, specifically through the WIFIA or EPA loan, the WIFIA being the Water Infrastructure Financing Innovation Act. So it's not about building the plant, that the decisions around that, the construction, the planning, and all that have been made already by councils over the last 12 years. I can speak specifically to the WIFIA EPA loan, and I just had a couple of recap bullet points here to summarize what Scott has already mentioned some of this, it does have a line of credit feature, which means that it's, we draw upon what we incur. So we're not paying debt on the full amount of the project right away. And likewise, there's also the ability to repay that at any time. There is a one-time rate reset where we can reset the rate. And Scott, I can't remember if that's within a year or 2 years off the top of my head, but it's within it's a one-time ability to be able to reset that rate, and knowing that the Fed is easing. They've eased 50 basis points already in the September meeting, and they're likely, I sat in an economic meeting, outlook meeting today, and they're going to be easing another 25 basis points this December, and even more next year. So we'll be able to reset our rate accordingly. It does have the flexibility of a 35-year term, which is a lot longer than typical structured financing instruments. And again, should we get grant funds, we would be able to repay on this loan without any penalties. It's also worth knowing that this is specifically for infrastructure capital improvements. WIFIA and the EPA are motivated lenders to get this money out there to cities such as ourselves, so that we are modernizing, we are updating our infrastructure accordingly. I mean, these are different times than when our original water treatment plant was built back in 1946. And so they're incenting cities such as ourselves to keep that in mind in terms of improving our infrastructure. Another important point about the WIFIA loan is that it is not secured by the taxpayers. It is secured by the revenues of the water fund specifically, and why that is important is the water fund will solely be covering the debt service of this particular loan. If we were needing to look for alternative financing, that may not be the case for very different instruments. Particularly, Scott mentioned the general obligation bond. That is under the full faith and credit of the city, and that would impact the city's other debt needs should it, for streets or for any other needs that we would have in the city. So in this particular case, the WIFIA can be completely secured by the revenues of the water fund. Finally, just want to mention too and report on our debt levels. We currently, as of fiscal year 2024, 6/30, it's not final yet. We're still in finishing up our audit, but our debt level is at 26 million. When compared to median cities of our size, we are so dramatically lower than those comparable cities by 100%. And even if we were to add a full 75 million to our debt level, we would still be under the typical median debt ratio for comparable cities. So, and that is that kind of summarizes my piece of it, and I will flip it back to you, Bert and Tara, for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Scott and Mariane. And we're going to start digging in on questions. Bert, would you like to kick us off?
I would, and we have a lot of questions in there. Thank you, but I'm going to jump in and ask a couple of follow-up questions, if I may. And Scott, a couple people have asked about the location, and just to get a fix in our heads about what we're talking about, could you put the location map back up? And Harriet, get Scott back to. think it was the last one you showed.
There we go. So as
Okay,
far as location, it's what we call the granite pit site. For most of you who have been up in the upper area know where the swimming hole is and the concrete Granite Street Reservoir. As you go around the corner of Granite Street and up a little bit towards what we call the 2060 Forest Service Road, it's up on the knoll up there. It's also the location that's been used in the past for helicopter logging and landing as well. So it's just to the west of the swimming hole. And those of you who know where the Wonder Trail is, the Wonder Trail wraps around that location as well.
Okay, we can see the reservoir where it says Granite Street there. Yeah,
Yep.
that's
This is the swimming hole, and then this is the concrete tank. And so right around the corner here, and up the hillside is the proposed location. And this is a city-owned property. And that's one of the benefits of having it is the city doesn't have to worry about acquiring property to build a treatment plant. And we looked at multiple different locations to site the new plant, and this one came out as the preferred alternative through that process.
Now the existing plant doesn't show on this view. How far further south is that?
So the existing plant is about a mile south in the canyon itself, up the water treatment plant road.
Is it close to Hosler Dam then?
And then another mile up the road is Reeder Reservoir and Hosler Dam.
Okay. All right, thank you. You can stop sharing there. You talked about the tap line and how much water Ashland uses yearly on a daily basis. And you mentioned that we could get up to 3 million gallons per day through the tap. What is Ashland's range in daily water use, winter, summer?
So the overall range, I will say, historically is about 1.75 million gallons a day, average winter, up to about 6 million gallons a day, maybe a little higher occasionally in the summer. So the overall average day is right in that 2.5 to 3 million gallons a day if you annualize the total amount used, yes.
Okay, so tap wouldn't be enough during the summer. It'd be plenty to cover it during the winter, but then you've got this cap on the annualized use of the water from.
Yeah, and one of the things that I should mention is the city council and all the local other municipalities who use the tap system. Ashland Council approved what we call a water sharing agreement. And so all of the local municipalities have a specific amount of water rights, and they've all bundled those water rights into the availability for other users from the Medford Water Commission source to use more of that. So there is the potential to use more than that 1,000 acre feet of Lost Creek storage right that the city has purchased by buying other people's excess water rights. And that agreement just allows for the other communities to reimburse on the storage costs and O&M costs for that additional water. And that was a long planning effort that the partner communities did a couple-year time period that kind of really protects everyone's water rights, allows sharing, and allows that system to stay in place. I think the demand forecast exceeds 2075 before all of the partner communities' water rights are exceeded based on their demand projections in the long term.
Okay, I've got one more for Scott, and then I got a couple for Mariane. People talk about this being a huge investment for the city and probably its largest infrastructure project ever, expenditure. Could you put that in perspective? I mean, Hosler Dam must have cost a fair chunk of change, the original water plant. And I mean, if we talk about a per capita basis, there were a few people in town, so that must have been a major expense in the late 40s when that was built. And of course, wastewater treatment plant, that was a big project. So where is this like double or the same or?
It's definitely more. So I believe the wastewater treatment plant upgrades that were done in the late 90s, early 2000s was about a total cost of 20 to 25 million dollars. It was in that range, I believe, for all the improvements that were done. So, 55 to 70 million dollars is significantly more for an infrastructure project relative to what the city has done previously.
Okay. Question for Mariane. The loan or the cap on that is 75 million. May not need to use all of that. I understand that. But say worst case scenario, if you used all 75 million, and the loan is, I think it's 35 years at 4.2%. Is that right? With the interest cost, what would the ratepayers of Ashland end up paying back over that 35 years total, including the principal and interest?
So if you're looking at the full 75 million, and we were looking at the 4.2% rate, and I did this earlier, so it would be about 110 million in interest. Again, we wouldn't be necessarily drawing it all out down at once, and we also have the ability to pay down at any time, and then also the feature of resetting that rate when rates ease in the next couple of years, which the Fed has indicated that they would. So I think I saw a question in the chat, are those typical terms? And they're not. For structured financing, generally structured financing, there's not a typical line of credit feature, nor is there a rate reset like that. You would typically be paying on the full amount right as you sign on the dotted line. So does that answer your question?
It does. And if it did, and again, I'm talking worst case scenario, I mean, the outside of the envelope, that comes up to about 185 million over 35 years. That's a little over $5 million a year. And might get some grants, pay for part of it, might pay back some of the loan. I get that. But again, worst case, 5 million a year. What is the current annual revenue for the water department?
Give me 1 second. I have that.
I believe it's about 8.5 million.
So it is right for charges of services. It's 8.5 million, and we also have system development charges and other types of revenue that go in there as well. So total revenue for fiscal 24 was 9.6 million.
Is there currently any debt service in the water department?
Yes, it's not a whole lot though. There's some debt there.
All right. I think let's go on to the Q&A. Tara, did you want to do that? Or?
Absolutely. We have a couple of questions about the water fund. And can you just explain sort of what that means and how that money is accrued?
I can start. So it is, I think the question from one of the participants was, how is it financed? So it's through rates, and Scott can talk about that a little bit more than I can, but ratepayers particularly. So it's not through other general fund sources is my delineation of that. But Scott, do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, the water fund is what we call an enterprise fund. So it's restricted. So the revenues that the ratepayers pay are restricted to that utility itself. So the money that comes into the water fund can't be used in another fund or a general obligation, general fund issue. It has to be spent within that fund itself. It has that restriction to cover itself.
And likewise, for the WIFIA loan, the debt itself cannot draw from any other fund or the general fund.
Thank you. That's helpful. So knowing that, one of the potential sources of repayment is through the water fund, which is tied to what folks pay for water. Can you talk a little bit about the expected rate increases and how that might be spread out across our population? Are there any caps involved due to income or usage? If you can just sort of explain that rate structure, that would be helpful.
So right now, we brought this before the city council, there was a rate study done in 2023 that was brought before the council with projected rate increases of 10% annually for 4 years and then lower rate increases past that. That didn't take into account any grant opportunities or things like that. That was kind of the cost of everything at that point in time. In discussions with the council, one of the things that we've moved forward with is what's called a cost of service study and rate analysis. So we have a consulting firm doing that financial package for us right now. We will be bringing the draft version to the city council in December for review. And as part of that overall plan development, the cost of service really looks at how to equitably charge the current customer classes. So irrigation, residential, multifamily, governmental, is part of that municipal, is part of that overall rate structure and how those customer charges get or how those charges get equitably distributed across the boundaries. They also develop the rate impacts for the system needs for capital maintenance, personnel costs is part of that. And one of the things that the council has asked us to do is look at increasing how progressive the rate structure is. So where can we recoup more revenue in the commodity charge at the higher end of the spectrum? So there's, 4 tiers and then the 5th tier of commodity charge is added in the summer. So can more revenue be recouped in those upper tiers to protect what we call the base rate or meter rate? So there's 2 fixed charges on your water bill as part of that. One is the meter charge and one is the base rate. And what the council wanted is those to be, fixed or not increase at the same rate that the commodity charges would increase. So that's part of what this rate study will be looking at that we will be presenting to the council itself in December. And part of the recommendation from the last rate study was a rate increase in January of this year and another one in July, which of course we haven't moved forward with while we're looking at the funding mechanisms, doing this cost of service study. But potentially there will be significant rate impacts to the water utility to fund the program.
And in part, Scott, right, we have not increased rates since 2019. Is that correct?
Yeah, the last water rate increase was 2019. And then I will mention too, one of the things that Mariane, the finance group, is working on, as well as Public Works in conjunction, is the city's low-income utility assistance program. And so part of that analysis is included in the water rights or water rate structure. The council looked at how do we expand access to that utility assistance program. Basically, it's an age-related program right now for qualifications and income. What the city council wanted us to do is remove that age restriction and allow to open up to all ages based on a larger income threshold reduction. So instead of 125%, 150% of the poverty level income threshold for access into that program. So part of that rate structure and balance is looking at that increased uptake of the low income utility assistance program for the city of Ashland. And that's, for water, but also for the other enterprises, electric, storm drain, transportation as well. So there would be updates to that program moving forward.
Thank you. That's helpful to know. And what I'm hearing really is we're not going to have that information fully until December. And how would you suggest folks sort of move forward, right? In terms of the decision that we're making here in a couple of weeks, we won't have the full picture for perhaps. So I'm curious, obviously you're in a position just to make recommendations. And I'm curious about what the recommendations are currently and what people might be able to expect in terms of rate increases, to expect in terms of protection of our lower income populations and elderly populations. Do you have any ballparks on the figures for that?
Well, like I said, last fall, when we presented before the council, the previous rate study, at those numbers at that time were multiple 10% rate increases, was the recommendation. And what I will say is part of what you look at in the rates is you look at the 2-year budget period, and kind of that's where you know you're going to be, because that's what you're going to request budget appropriations to fund. So your rate manages to meet that appropriation level request. The outlook, the 4 through 6 or year periods past the current biennium, are things that are adjustable that would take into account a refresh at the next budget cycle. So the rate adjustments are kind of always a living, moving document as you go forward, because you always want to do them on the biennial cycle in association with the budget. So they align with what your actual budget needs would be when you go through that budget process. And so we're always looking at kind of amending those. And then, the other thing that always moves or can move is when you spend that money for your projects. So there's some variability where you can move projects around potentially to lower the rate, because you won't need as much revenue for that period because you've shifted a project out or changed it a little bit. So, and then when grants come in, they offset your rates a little bit as well.
I will also just mention too, Scott's done a really great job with the water fund ending fund balance. It's been accumulating over the years, and to date, the ending fund balance for the water fund is at 18.5 million, and the cash is at 16.3 million. So it's got a healthy financial position.
And that was one of the functions of the financial structure that was developed as part of the 2012 master plan. Was the city knew some big water infrastructure projects were coming down the pipe. And what the financial plan outlined was accumulating a healthy ending fund balance to assist in paying either cash for some of these big projects and or help pay the debt service. So you wouldn't see potentially one-time rate spikes of, say, 50%, 25%. It was to kind of keep those rate spikes over time from happening.
Follow up for Scott on the recommended water rate increases. You mentioned several 10% increases. Would those be annual or biannual? And how many? Are we talking about 3, 5?
It was 4 in a row, and then it dropped down to kind of an inflationary level, and those would be annually. At past performance, the city has council has approved rate increases that take effect July 1 annually. That aligns with, as I mentioned, kind of the biennium budget start.
We have several questions about financing and bonds and options that we've explored in terms of grant funding. It would be helpful if we could sort of talk through that in as simplified a path as possible, just to kind of outlay the research that's been done up to this point for funding of the water treatment plant. And sort of what we're looking at. I know the WIFI loan is on the table. For example, so what are some of the things that the city is currently either applied for, in the line for, or planning to apply for to help finance this project?
So the city is in line from a grant standpoint for about 9.3 million from the state for that emerging contaminants. In my conversations with the state, I've let it be known that the city would like to have access to that grant money in spring of 2025 as part of the project itself. And so I'm waiting from feedback for them because they get their money from the federal government to allocate, in October timeframes on the federal governmental year. And so we should be hearing back from them between, I hope, now and the end of the year on when that funding would be available as far as that emerging contaminant grant itself. As far as another grant, as I mentioned, the Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities Grant through FEMA, that is about a 2-year process. We've provided the pre-application information to the Office of Emergency Management, and we have been notified that we can move on to the sub-application portion of that project or grant. And that sub-application is due, I believe, in March of 2025. That information is then reviewed by a technical advisory committee, and they make the determination if you move on for what they call further consideration, or you don't meet the qualifications of the BRIC grant program, or no further action is taken. And so if the city's selected for further consideration, then it goes for more formal review, and we would be notified in the spring, summer of 2026. And again, that's a $50 million grant opportunity maximum through FEMA for the BRIC program itself with a 10% local match. And so those are the grant opportunities that we've, entered into or chasing down. We did apply for $6 million of low interest funding through the state, of which for disadvantaged communities, the state has been giving back about 50% of that $6 million loan as grant forgiveness. So again, we should be notified in spring of 2025 if we're selected for that $6 million loan, with potentially up to half of that being forgivable. And as part of our financing structure, in talking with our financial advisors and the finance department, one of the things that's beneficial for the WIFIA program is that we would try to use those grant sources and some of our existing fund balance to postpone a draw against the WIFIA loan potentially, as part of that, to allow for an interest rate reset maybe, or to lower the interest costs in the long term. So that's something on the financial side we've been talking about programmatically to help protect the rates as much as we feasibly can. And then obviously just a revenue bond, which the city has issued before, which has a higher interest rate and a shorter term, 30 years at 4.2% relative to the WIFIA program, which is a 35-year term at 4.16%. And so that's why we've kind of focused with the EPA through the WIFIA program. And we've been working with them since fall of 2021 on contractual documents and back and forth to meet all the requirements of the WIFIA program to help fund the project itself. And this is in coordination with city staff, bond counsel, financial advisors, the EPA representatives. We've been back and forth, and Mariane knows numerous meetings with them working through this process.
And it's also worth noting that it's surrounding cities have also taken advantage of the WIFIA loan, Medford and Grants Pass, and have gone back for more. So it has been a successful program for funding infrastructure.
Thank you. That's really helpful to know. Can you give us an idea of the expected timeline for the building of the plant, just in terms of, we've got a lot of balls in the air right now. When would the ideal time be to start construction on the new plant?
So depending on the outcome of the election, in our coordination with the EPA, we would look to close the contract documents kind of in early 2025, and then move forward with bidding the project, selecting a contractor, and beginning construction for the project. So I would say summer to fall of 2025, at the best case scenario, would be the start of construction, with an anticipated 30-month window of construction activities for the whole project. And that would include the offsite work. So there's piping, electrical work that needs to be done offsite, and then all of the onsite work, which is the actual physical construction of the building, and the other components itself on what I mentioned as the granite pit site.
We've also had some questions, and this is like we're going to go in a completely different direction now. So hold on, everyone. There's a few questions about sort of the siting, climate change, wildfire risk. Can you give us sort of an outline of the benefits of the proposed location in comparison to the current location?
So the proposed location is kind of out of the canyon. It's out of that heavily forested area. It's out of the floodplain, and it's on, away from high hazard landslide mapped areas itself. So the proposed location kind of mitigates those specific risks that the current plant faces. And so that's one of the reasons why it's generally meets the criteria of the FEMA BRIC program, because you're mitigating known hazards of the existing condition with the new condition and the new project. As far as climate change, one of the things that's been developed over the years is a look at the water quality for the reservoir itself. And so what the climate change analysis shows for Reeder Reservoir and the Ashland watershed is lower snowpack levels, higher spring rainfall, higher temperatures on what we call the shoulder months. So earlier in the summer, later spring season, warmer temperatures, and then later into fall, warmer temperatures. And I think, everyone just experienced early October where we had multiple 90-degree days. And so from a water quality standpoint, what that does for the city is, increases the algal blooms in the reservoir and sustains them for potentially longer. The also rain events that we would see in spring and fall potentially would increase the runoff of material in the watershed. So the granitic material runoff into the reservoir itself, which increases turbidity. And so from a water quality treatment standard, that's why we looked at the ozone to help with algal issues, which primarily now generate the taste and odor compounds that appear in our water system. And then also turbidity spikes through the flashy rain events get removed in a sedimentation step. So those two steps don't exist at the current plant itself.
Working on catching up with the questions that we've answered in the chat right now. Speaking of the algal blooms, have we had any in our current water system?
So we have algal blooms every year in Reeder Reservoir, and we manage them to the best we can. We have an aquatic scientist on retainer. They sample the raw water to determine the type of algal bloom it is. And then he works with our treatment plant staff to come up with a treatment protocol for the reservoir itself. We've been fortunate to date that we haven't had what's called a harmful algae bloom, which is a cyanotoxin issue, which you've heard around the state is under new regulatory requirements. But we have had a cyanotoxin hit in 2020 when the city was using the Talent Irrigation District source. So the city has water rights through TID that they can use as a municipal use to supplement Reeder Reservoir. And so in 2020, the city was pumping TID water to the treatment plant to blend and treat with the Reeder water. And we did have a toxic algae hit in that raw water. And so at that point, we shut the TID system down because we didn't want to have that come out in the treated water potentially, because that's a significant impact to the distribution system in the community. Currently, generally, the algal blooms that we have in the reservoir create what's called taste and odor compounds. which some community members will know. They'll smell a difference in the water itself that gets treated. And that's kind of what it is, and that's been a long-standing issue with the community. I've found information going back to the early 90s in council records where it talks about the taste and odor issues and trying to manage that from a treatment standpoint. So that's been a long-going water quality concern for the community. And that's one of the reasons, again, the ozone addition will help eliminate that from the treated water system.
And there was a question in our Q&A about the ozone treatment. Wondering if that's something that could be applied to our currently existing water treatment plant using existing funding sources.
So as part of kind of an alternatives, and I think this was in 2022, we worked with HDR, the engineer of record for the project, to look at what rehabilitation at the existing plant would cost and look like, and could you add a pre-treatment capability of ozone to it? And the answer is yes, you can physically do it at that location. There would be a significant amount of work and cost, but the real concern is, adding additional infrastructure into that risked area, and is that the wisest choice? And providing that information to the city council, from a policy standpoint, still decided to move forward with construction of the new facility and the new location.
Let me follow up on that, Scott. There's talk a little bit about the do nothing option, which wouldn't really be do nothing, but to keep the current plant, keep it going for 10, 20 years, whatever the possible lifespan is. What does that look like?
So, there is some life cycle replacements that would need to occur at the existing plant. General equipment's going to need to get replaced. Your chemical costs for the existing treatment plant are going to be higher and increase in the future. But there's some major equipment that we would have to replace in that 10 to 20 year period, basically kind of the control system, some of the electrical. There's some piping that will have to be replaced. So, you're still looking at a pretty significant, maintenance O&M, during that period to keep the existing plant functioning at the high level and meeting the regulatory requirements for treated water. I believe the treatment fund itself is a couple $1 million annually, which is the material, services, and personnel costs. So you would continue on with that in your chemical, and then you would have some capital costs associated with replacing the telemetry, electrical, some of the control and instrumentation at the plant. There's been talk in the past about development of a flood wall to protect the plant from flooding. And so there's been that discussion as well. That could be an addition, but even installation and construction of a flood wall isn't 100% guarantee of an issue happening at that location. It just reduces potential issues from flooding impacts in the canyon itself. So those are components that could be done to maintain it for that 20-year period. But then you're looking at, as we talked about before, what does that look like from a sunk cost? And do you still want to maintain the plant at that location or move to a new location and build a new facility at that time frame?
And that sort of, I think, is a good segue into some questions we've got about funding. So with the WIFIA grant, can we use the WIFIA payment, can we use grants to repay that loan?
So what grants would do is reduce what we would take from the WIFIA program itself. As part of the overall financing package. There's some monetary math issues with grants and the EPA, depending on the color of money. So what we talked about is you can't match the EPA requirement, that 80-20 I mentioned, because they're federal funds. So you can't use 20% of your match as federal funds. So if you receive any sort of grant that's a federal fund, that doesn't count towards the match requirement to get you to that maximum level. So from what we would do, it would just be to reduce what we would borrow from the EPA itself with those additional monies. So that bill emerging contaminant grant that the city is on the intended use plan, that $9.3 million, that would be 9.3 less of a project total that we would take from the WIFIA. The 6 million from the state with 3 million potential forgiveness would be that much less that we would take from the WIFIA program. The BRIC funding will also reduce what we would need to borrow from the EPA if the city were to receive that funding. So I think of it more as a reduction in what we would need to borrow and not something that you would use to pay it back.
Great, that's helpful. And with the WIFIA funding, then I understand we would need to match a certain proportion of the $75 million. What's the plan for that matching funding?
So that match has already come from in-kind contributions from the city. So the city is the property owner, and that property has a land value, which was used to develop that 20% portion. The city has already spent multiple millions of dollars in engineering, design and development alternatives analysis, which have been used as part of that in-kind match. So the EPA calculates that maximum amount they will give you based on what you've already provided as that in-kind match. And so that's what got the city to the $75 million maximum. Now, the EPA, as we move forward, if the city receives that $9.3 million grant, that is federal funds. So they will reduce that $75 million maximum by that $9.3 million is the total amount that you could borrow against their program.
Scott, does that impact rates too? I mean, the receiving of those grants?
Significantly, potentially, yeah. And that's one of the things that we still need the consultant to do as part of this cost of service is, run the analysis with receiving these grants and show what the rates would be with and without that.
Meaning that if we secure the grants, the rate increases would be lower.
Correct.
So there's a lot of questions about the percentage of increase in water bills. So there's been a lot of talk on social media and numbers like 77% increases in our total water costs have been thrown around. I'd be curious to know what part of the water bill are we talking about having the rate increases applied to? I've heard the base rate, we want to keep kind of at the same rate. So then what part of our bill then becomes the increase? Is it the base rate?
And that's one of the alternatives that the rate study is looking at is, what would be an increase to the base rate? What would be an increase to the different tiers in the commodity charges in order to get to that revenue requirement that you need to support the fund and the debt service projections itself. So, in theory, the base and meter rate could go up by 3%. And then the commodity charge can go up by first tier 10%, second tier 15, third tier 20, things like that. So those are kind of the progressive structure outlines that we're looking at as part of this rate study to bring back to council to see from a policy direction, where do they want to go? And historically, the city has taken the rate increase and applied it across everything equally. So a 10% rate increase from a revenue requirement would be applied to the base, the meter, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 in the commodity charges. That's what the city's done historically. We're trying to look at it right now from a different angle.
And to clarify too, those rate increases are just for the water portion. I mean, it sounds like that's an obvious thing, but we in Ashland have 4 utilities. And so when you think about a 10% increase of your utility bill, for just the water, if my utility bill is, for my family of five is over $200 a month. So it's not going to be 10% of that amount. It's going to be 10% of, or whatever the percentage is that comes from the rate study. It will be 10% of my water amount, which is typically $30 to $50. So it comes out to a $3 or $5 increase. Perspective, just to kind of clarify that.
Yeah, that's helpful to sort of wrap our brains around what that means in terms of what that, in my case, email bill will look like in the future.
Right.
So what happens if voters vote no? What plans does the city have if this ballot measure is defeated?
So I think that that's a question for the city council on how they want to move forward from a policy standpoint for funding kind of capital infrastructure projects. There are other options on the table that we've chatted about tonight: revenue bonds, general obligation bonds, straight borrowing, bank lending borrowing potentially are other options to fund the project and or projects moving forward. So really that would have to be a policy discussion with the city council itself.
I have a question, Scott. I don't see it in the Q&A here, but the solar, how much does that option add to the cost of the proposed new plant?
We were $2 to $3 million, I think, for a 199 kilowatt array on the facility at the site there. One of the things that we've talked about is we're looking at that as an alternative addition to the bid. So the city can either accept it or not as part of a construction process. We've talked about going after Oregon Department of Energy grants for renewables and things like that. So there are options for getting grant money to cover the cost of solar and the battery system as well. So it's just going to come to an overall cost and what the city council wants to approve on a construction basis.
Do you know how much would be saved per year and how long the payoff lifespan would be?
Payoff's pretty long, but what we did calculate, and I can't remember what that payoff is, but what it does provide is, I believe it's 172 days of net time power generation for the plant. So basically during the day, for over half the year, the plant could operate on solar itself without any grid draw. And that was one of the kind of the resiliency components that we're trying to build in to the new plant, is having not only diesel backup generator for emergency issues, but also having solar and potentially battery storage as another resiliency measure if we were to ever enter into an emergency situation where we were without power for an extended period of time.
So I'm seeing there's some good chatter happening in our Q&A panel. Do you see any downsides of us pursuing the WIFIA funding? Do you see any downsides to the other grant alternatives that we have ahead of us?
So generally, some funding sources are easier to manage from an administrative standpoint and a reporting standpoint. When you're funding a project of this nature, they're all almost equal. So using a state funding source versus the EPA, from the administrative management, documentation control, reporting, they're all going to be similar. You're going to have similar Buy American requirements because you're using federal funds. You're going to have similar prevailing wage requirements for the construction impact. So all those things are generally similar of what you're going to have to do on the reporting basis. So it's just from us, the flexibility in our discussions with the financial advisors and finance. The WIFIA just provides a little bit more flexibility than other traditional borrowing methods. And it really improved when they opened up the small cities program that allowed 80% and 20% relative to a larger city, which is 49% funded with 50% local match. That was really a benefit for smaller utilities to gain access to large sums of money for important large-scale capital projects.
Does sound like exactly what we're talking about in this moment. So that feels like good timing. We're coming to the end of our time together. We've got about 5 minutes left with our participants, and we still have a good number of them here with us this evening. What is one thing you hope everyone takes away from this conversation as they head towards their ballots here in the next coming weeks? Just one thing, no big deal.
I'll let Mariane go first.
Well, I'm happy to go first. Having been the person that showed up on the scene a year and a half ago, and having to have read 12 years of documents on this, there was a lot of work that has been put forth, not just obviously Scott has been through it from the beginning, but our predecessors, but also previous city councils. And I think the conclusions that they've arrived at consistently throughout the years, and similarly with our neighboring cities, that this WIFIA program, and because it's about the financing of the water treatment plant. I'm not discussing about whether or not we should be constructing a new water treatment plant, but the financing of the water treatment plant under a WIFIA loan under the EPA is a favorable source of funding for small cities such as ourselves. And so I think I would leave it at that. I think there's a lot of eyes have looked at this, including our financial advisors who are ensuring that we have adequate debt coverage. And like I said, it's the first thing that I looked at when I came on board was to see where our debt levels are and whether or not this was sustainable. And so that's where I'll leave it.
You, Scott, I'm going to have you hold for just a moment because there's an important question that came up in the Q&A. Can we say that the WIFIA funding is implicitly a part of the water revenue bonds, right? So what we're actually voting on is the authorization of water revenue bonds. Is that automatically tied to WIFIA funding? Should we think of them as being the same thing? Or are we talking about two different funding streams here?
This measure is about the financing through the WIFIA and EPA loan. Yes. So if it gets voted down, again, like Scott said, it would be a city council decision, a policy decision as to, how to move forward. But from a financing perspective, should, the construction move forward as all city councils have already decided, then we would have to look for alternative financing that is not the WIFIA loan anymore.
Thank you for that. Okay, Scott, we bought you a little time. What's your one takeaway for the group?
I would just say that anybody listening or wanting to find more information, on the website and then in Laserfish, there's a lot of background documentation going back years on this through council actions and budget actions and background information and contract approvals. So if you really want to learn some more details past what we've kind of just covered at a very high level, there's a lot of documentation available for review. And in fact, the city has an FAQ page on the website providing some additional information as part of the overall project. So that is available for people to peruse at their leisure if you really want to dive into some of the specific details.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you so much, Mariane. Having you here tonight to share this information with us has just been invaluable. I can't thank you enough for making time on on a Wednesday evening to talk about the water treatment plant again. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I
Thank
just
you.
want to, before we close out, let everyone know that we will be sending a list of resources to everyone who's attended. And we'll also be sending out an evaluation form. Let us know how we did tonight. Let us know if there are other topics you'd like us to cover. And we'd love to make sure that Ashland.news and our partners can provide the information needed for our city. And now I'm going to sign off and open the floor to y'all to say your goodbyes as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
I'd like to mention that we will have a recording on this, that if you want to share that, we will send that out in our newsletter. If you haven't signed up, go to ashland.news, upper left corner, click on subscribe to the newsletter. It's free. You'll get your newsletter on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings. And we're here trying to help the community make informed decisions. It's hard to figure out where you're going if you don't know where you're at. So I hope tonight has helped you figure out where we're at. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. And if you value what we've done tonight, we do ask that you donate and support the work that Ashland.news is doing for our community. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.